Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today's the day. We are going to make a video about shaders and overlays for retro handhelds. And this is a video I've been putting off for years at this point. I tried this a couple years back for specific devices, and man, I was in over my head. But over the years, I've really learned a lot when it comes to, shaders and filters and overlays, all that kind of stuff. And I want to apply everything that I know to handhelds today. Now, there's an entire world out there when it comes to tweaking all the settings for your devices, and so we are going to try to focus this as much as possible, but we're going to apply a bunch of principles that you can use for other devices as well. So in this video, we're going to focus on one specific screen aspect ratio as well as resolution. So that's going to be 480p devices that have a 4:3 aspect ratio. Now, thankfully, there are a ton of different devices of different shapes and sizes that use this exact same screen dimension. So no matter what device you own, be it a Mio Mini Plus or maybe one of the Anbernic RGXX devices, any of these are going to work with this video here. And the reason why I want to focus on 480p resolutions in this guide is because those are usually going to be on lower power devices, which are harder to use when it comes to shaders, but then also a 480p display is very hard to get just right. When it comes to higher resolution and wider aspect ratio systems, things get a lot easier, and so we're not going to focus on that. We're going to focus on the cheap stuff today. And because there are so many software options out there for these types of devices, I will try to cover all of those in this video as well. As you can imagine, we've got a ton of ground to cover, so maybe grab 2 snacks and a drink this time around, and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, first things first, I want to mention that I have a complete written guide that I've been working on for weeks at this point, which is also being published as of today. And as of releasing this video, that guide is over 13,000 words, so I've been working on this a ton. I've got a ton of different examples for all the different things that you can change about a screen and how they will be affected on different firmwares. In addition, I'll walk you through all the different things you can do for each of the major consoles. So for example, you want the best effects possible for a Game Boy or Game Boy Color. Each of those have their own sections. In addition, I've gone through and picked my favorite combination when it comes to shaders or overlays so that you have the best experience possible for each of those, at least according to my own tastes. And to wrap that all up, I've also created an overlays and shaders pack, so you can download this and put it on whatever device that you're using, and you should be able to load it as long as it runs RetroArch. So long story short, even though I'll walk you through the entire process in this video, you can also do it at your own pace with the written guide. Now, I also want to mention that I had a little bit of help getting this guide together. I had a developer named Ben Jelter help me through the entire process. And he makes a bunch of different overlays and community packs available for everybody, and so I've referenced a lot of them in my guide as well. In addition, he develops his own Game Boy games, and one of them just came out. It's called Unearthed. And this was actually made in collaboration with the guy who made the Grimace's birthday Game Boy Color game, if you remember that from a year or two ago. And I'll leave a link to their new Game Boy game in the video description below, and it's actually a lot of fun. You can play it directly in the browser to get a feel of it before you decide whether or not you want to buy it. It's a top-down puzzle game that reminds me a bit of Mole Mania, so you will dig below, then move to new areas, and then dig back up. Either way, I wanted to give Ben a quick shout out just because he helped me so much in proofreading and getting this guide all together. So let's go ahead and start going through the guide now. And the way I'm going to organize this video is I'm going to talk about each of the components of a screen and the things that you can do to affect it, and then we'll put that all together at the end once we understand what we're working with. So let's start with the very basics, which is going to be screen size, and that can vary depending on the handheld. So for example, with the Mio A30, we've got a 2.8-inch screen, but then on something like the Mio Mini Plus, it's 3.5 inches, although they have the same resolution of 480p. And then finally, we've got something that's even 4 inches large, and this is going to be the same resolution and screen as well, just in a larger size. And the size of your screen might affect the way that you approach your settings. For example, with a 3.5-inch screen, you may want to do integer scaling, which will make the overall screen smaller, but it'll look a lot sharper. Meanwhile, on a 2.8-inch screen, you may not want to use integer scaling because it'll make the screen so small. So in this one, we're using non-integer scaling. We're blowing it up as big as we can with the same aspect ratio. And so depending on the size of your screen, you might have different preferences, and that's totally cool as well. So that's the first component, and that's going to be just the overall size of the screen that you're working with. Somewhere between 2.8 inches or 4 inches is generally the standard for 4:3 480p screens. Now the next component of a screen is going to be its aspect ratio. That's going to be its overall height versus its width, and we're going to be using 4:3 screens here. And again, there's going to be a variety of devices that have a 4:3 aspect ratio screen. Now, when it comes to home consoles, up until the modern era, most of our TVs were a 4:3 aspect ratio, and so most home consoles will just naturally be 4:3 or something very close to it. And so that means that when we present a game in 4:3 on one of these screens, it's generally going to look pretty good. There are going to be some exceptions, like Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Those were 10:9, so they're a little bit more squarish, and then Game Boy Advance was 3:2, so it was more widescreen. And so those are some factors that we have to take into account when we present them on a 4:3 aspect ratio display, but of course we will cover that in this video. And finally, the last major component of a screen is going to be its resolution. That's how many pixels there are. And these devices that we're talking about today have 640 across and then 480 down. And so that's what we're talking about when we say a 480p display. Now, when we put all three of these together, the size, the aspect ratio, and the resolution, when it comes to a 480p screen like this, we actually don't have a lot to work with when it comes to scaling. There are going to be some systems that just work perfectly out of the box. Things like PlayStation and Dreamcast and Nintendo 64, all of those had a 4:3 aspect ratio and can scale to 480p no problem. However, for most of the other older systems, there's always going to be something that's a little bit off, which does require us to do some effects. And so that's what we're covering in this video. So now let's talk about scaling, and integer scaling in particular. We're going to start with Game Boy Advance. And when we talk about scaling, we're talking about blowing up the image as much as possible. So in this example here, I have made the Game Boy Advance screen as big as possible on this display. And because Game Boy Advance is a little bit wider than 4:3, you can see that we have black bars at the top and bottom. This is because we're preserving the original aspect ratio of Game Boy Advance. If we wanted, we could actually blow this all the way up to 4:3, but then everything's going to look a little bit stretched and tall. So throughout this video, we are going to preserve aspect ratio as much as possible with these original consoles. Now, the scaling that we're doing here is what is called non-integer scaling. So instead of being like 2x or 3x the Game Boy Advance resolution, we're just blowing it up as much as possible. And without getting into the math or anything, when you blow up a Game Boy Advance screen to be full screen on a 480p display like this, it's going to be a 2.7x scale. This means it's a little bit less than a 3x integer scale and obviously bigger than a 2x integer scale. So let me show you now the difference between non-integer scaling as we see here and then integer scaling. We're going to jump into the RetroArch settings and then adjust that within the video settings. So we're going to jump into the RetroArch quick menu, and I'm using newly right here. So that's going to be menu plus B. And so here I'm going to back out and I'm going to go into settings and then video. Finally, under there's a setting called scaling, and then there's an option that says integer scaling on or off. And you can see here that I have integer scaling turned off, and then aspect ratio is set to core provided. That means that whatever the emulator thinks the aspect ratio is going to be for this device, which is 3:2, that's what it's going to show on the display. So now I'm going to turn on integer scaling. That means it's going to scale to the largest number possible, but keeping it a whole number. And when we turn it on here, you might be able to see underneath that the image is getting a lot smaller. And so going back to our image now, this is a full 2x integer scale on a 480p display. And as you can see, the black bars have gotten a lot bigger, and that's because it's not scaling up to 3x, it's too big for that, and so it has to go down to 2x. Now there are other tricks you can do, like integer scaling over scale, but that's not really going to work with Game Boy Advance either. And so instead, I recommend using non-integer scaling. That does mean it's not going to be a perfect integer scale, and so some of these pixels will be unbalanced, but that also gives us an opportunity to try out other things like shaders and overlays, which we'll talk about later in this video. Either way, my point here is that when it comes to integer scaling Game Boy Advance, I do recommend using non-integer scaling, just because the image is too small when it comes to integer scaling on a 480p display. Now, before we move on, I want to do one other integer scaling example. This is going to be with Mega Man X on the Super Nintendo. And I love using this game as an example because it's very easy to see when something is going to be off. So right now we're using non-integer scaling, which means we're blowing it up to full screen, and this is going to be a 2.1x scale. That means this is just a little bit larger than a full 2x integer scale. And if we go into the integer scaling options again, when we toggle between the two, you can see that the screen gets a little bit smaller every time we turn integer scaling on. And so here's what the game looks like in integer scaling with a 2x integer scale. You can see there are just slightly larger black borders around the sides. And depending on the size of the image that you're working with, for example here with a 4-inch screen, you may not mind having a smaller image overall because the screen itself is relatively large. And so in this example, an integer scale on a 4-inch screen is actually still larger than non-integer scaling on a 3.5-inch screen. And so in this case, you're getting a larger screen than the other, but with perfectly balanced pixels as well. So now let's talk about pixel balance when it comes to integer scaling and why this even matters in the first place. And again, Mega Man X is a perfect example because on the life bar, you can see that every pill is perfectly balanced. And this is because we are using integer scale on this 4-inch display right here. Now, if we turn off integer scale, you can see that the image is bigger. The black borders are now smaller around the sides, but now you can also see that the little pills in the life bar are no longer balanced. And that's because we're working with a 2.1x scale, which means that it's not integer scaled, and instead we're going to have imbalanced pixels. And so this is one of the things that we're going to address in this video today, is to try to use the best shaders possible to be able to get balanced pixels while still having a large display. Either way, that's a quick rundown of what it means when we say integer scaling and non-integer scaling, because we are going to talk about that quite a bit throughout the video. And also bear in mind that there are plenty of consoles that will do integer scaling on a 480p display, including those higher end systems like PlayStation, Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and Saturn. In addition, depending on the emulator that you're using and how it interprets all of those pixels, other systems are also integer scaled, like Sega Genesis, Sega CD, and 32X, as well as Neo Geo. And so when it comes to those systems, we don't have to really worry about integer scaling, but rather just getting a nice shader to make the effect look really good. Now next I want to talk about a couple components that you can do to affect the screen on handheld systems, things like colorization as well as color correction and interframe blending. So let's start with colorization, which is a term that's used mostly for the original Game Boy. If you've ever started up a Game Boy game in RetroArch and you've seen it in black and white, you've probably been surprised and thought, I don't remember any sort of black and white Game Boy. But the truth is, when it came to Game Boy, it was basically in grayscale. The color that you remember, like the green on the DMG or the light blue on the Pocket, that all came from the LCD panel itself. And it all really had to do with the technology at the time. And so when we do try to present a Game Boy game on an LCD display like this, it is going to show up in black and white. Now thankfully these emulator cores are aware of this, and so there is options for what they call colorization, to add a color to the image. And the most common RetroArch Game Boy emulator is going to be Gambate, so that's what we're going to focus on here. So this time we're going to jump back into the RetroArch quick menu by pressing Menu and B, and then we're going to go down to Core Options. And under here, the first setting you will find is Game Boy Colorization. What I recommend doing is setting this to internal. And you've got other options like Game Boy Color and Super Game Boy, but we're going to stick with this one for now. Now below that, under Internal Palette, we have a bunch of different options, and these are all colorization settings that you can set depending on what you prefer. For example, the Game Boy DMG palette is going to try to mimic the original Game Boy Color. And so if we set that and then we go back and we select Quick Menu Resume, you can see that, yeah, we are back here and now we have a green tint instead. And there are plenty of other options. For example, this is Game Boy Pocket Colorization. And so that's what we're talking about when we say colorization. It's going to be for the original Game Boy and setting a color to what you prefer the most. Now the next thing to talk about is color correction. This is mostly going to be used for things like Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance. So the issue here is that LCD panels are a lot more saturated than they were back in the day. And so there are options to reduce the color saturation to make it more realistic like it used to be when you played the Game Boy Color back then. So let's use Game Boy Color as our example. So right now we have no color correction on, and you can see that the image is very saturated. It actually looks pretty nice. But chances are you may think this is overly saturated and you'd want something that's a little bit more realistic. Well, again, we're going to go back into the Core Options setting within the quick menu. So we'll go back down here. And underneath the colorization options, you have an option here for color correction. And in this case, we're going to turn it on for Game Boy Color only. Now underneath that, we have two options. We have accurate as well as fast. Fast is going to be a little bit more saturated, whereas accurate is going to be very desaturated. So let's try accurate first just to get an idea of what it looks like. And so this right here is the accurate image. And you can see that, yeah, it's a lot more desaturated and the colors still pop pretty well because this is a colorful game, but it is a lot less saturated than it was before. Now, fast color correction is somewhere in between, where it's still pretty saturated, but not as bad as it was before. And so this is the one I generally recommend because it's just a little bit more accurate than having super saturated colors. But of course, this will be completely personal preference. And finally, the last setting that I wanted to mention within this section is called interframe blending. And this provides an LCD ghosting effect, again, to mimic those older LCD panels. We've got 4 different options here. We can either turn it off, or we have what they call simple, or then accurate and fast. And you can mess around with each of these, but I found that simple is usually the best one in general, just because it gives a little bit of ghosting, but not too much. And so in this example, as you see my character jump up and down, you might see a little bit of ghosting of the character itself as it moves. And again, this is to mimic the original Game Boy DMG feel, because there was a lot of ghosting on that system. Again, this is just personal preference, but if you're trying to dial in your settings to make it as accurate as possible, this is another thing you should consider. Okay, so now that we have some of the basics down, including things like screen size, resolution, scaling, and integer scaling, as well as some of the things that you may want to do to handheld systems to improve the overall look and feel, now let's jump into the effects that you can actually use, and this is the really exciting stuff. Now, essentially, there are three different things that we're going to work with. The first are called filters, then shaders, and then overlays. Now, the first is filters, and these are CPU intensive, and I like to think about these as they are affecting the image as it appears on the screen. And because they're CPU intensive, that means they have a performance tax, because most emulation, especially on retro systems, will run off the CPU. And so that means that with cheaper and low-powered handhelds, it will affect the performance, and that's definitely not a good thing. But we'll still talk about filters and why they are important. Now, next we have shaders, and these apply to the image after it appears and kind of goes over the top of it. And these can be used in a bunch of different ways, and they are GPU intensive, and so often these will work a little bit better when it comes to performance compared to filters. And then finally, we've got overlays, and as the name implies, that means it's something you lay over the image itself, and this will usually be some sort of texture. And these will also have a low performance tax as well, and so I've always found that shaders and overlays will generally work better with lower end systems than filters. So let's start by talking about filters. We're going to use Mario 3 as our example on the NES, and this is with non-integer scaling and everything blown up and no other effects applied. And if you look at the overall image, you can see that it's relatively unbalanced. For example, if you look at the text and start, you can see that some of the letters are a little bit darker on some sides than others. And same thing with the text down here. It looks a little bit jaggedy and just a little bit off. And so this is a result of that non-integer scaling that we were talking about before. These pixels are unbalanced, and so everything just looks a little bit weird. And so in this example, we're going to try to use some filters to balance everything out. Now, when it comes to filters, there's one that's really well known, and then there's a bunch of others. The one that everyone usually knows about is called a bilinear filter. And this one is actually in a different section of RetroArch. So let's go to that first. We're going to go into the quick menu, and then we're going to back out until we get over to settings, then go into video, and then scaling. This is the same place where we had the integer scale and aspect ratio settings. But here you can see below aspect ratio, we have an option to turn on or off bilinear filtering. Let's turn it on. Now that we have bilinear filtering on, you might notice that all the text is actually perfectly balanced. You can see now that the text is nice and chunky. You can see the word start now has a perfect balance to it. And so that's the best thing about bilinear filtering, is that it will balance out all of your pixels and it'll look really great. However, as you'll find with a lot of the other settings that we're going to use, it comes at a cost. And in this case, it makes everything look very blurry. If we look at the image again with bilinear filtering on, you can see that yes, it just looks a lot smoother and kind of out of focus. Meanwhile, if we go back and turn it off, you can see that yeah, it's a lot crisper, but again, everything is unbalanced. Now the thing is that bilinear filtering can actually work pretty well in some contexts. For example, if you have a high pixel density playing PS1 or Nintendo 64, it actually will work pretty well because it'll smooth everything out, but because there's so many pixels, you don't really notice that it's so out of focus. Additionally, you can combine this filter with other filters to get an even better effect. So now let's talk about where you can find the other filters. They're going to be found within settings and then video, and then down below you'll see an option at the very bottom that says video filter. And within here, you'll find that RetroArch already has a bunch preloaded. Now, like I mentioned before, filters are CPU intensive. And so as a result, when you try to use some of these filters, it may affect your performance negatively. And bilinear filtering is unique in that regard because it works really well on low powered systems. For example, if you tried to use one of these blurred filters on a low powered device, it will usually be too much for the CPU and you won't be able to play it at full speed. However, my favorite filter is this one. It's called Normal 2x. Now, I'm not perfectly sure how this works, but my understanding is that the filter will blow up the image to twice its size and then shrink it back down. And somehow along that magical journey, it'll actually smooth out the pixels while keeping them very sharp. Now the tricky thing is that in order to get the Normal 2x filter to work properly, you also have to turn on bilinear filtering. So let's do that right now. We're going to turn on the Normal 2x filter, and you can see that it's been applied because underneath that, you will now have an option to remove the video filter. From there, we're going to go to the top of the screen, go into scaling, and then turn on bilinear filtering. And so now the combination of the two are going to smooth out the pixels and then also make them relatively sharp. And so here's a combination of these two filters. You can see that the image is relatively balanced and it's also relatively sharp by comparison. And so really that's about it when it comes to filters. I don't want to spend too much time on them just because they require so much performance power. And also most of these filters, other than bilinear filtering, will not work well with a shader, which is going to be the next thing we talk about. So long story short, if you are looking for a quick way to get some balanced as well as pretty sharp pixels, then I think a bilinear filter plus Normal 2x filter is a pretty good solution. Okay, next let's talk about shaders, and these are one of the most important parts of this entire video because there are so many of them and they can do so many different things. To start, let's break down the two types of shaders that you can find within RetroArch. They're going to be GLSL as well as slang. Now the GLSL ones are a little bit older, they're made with OpenGL in mind, and they will work on most low power devices, especially those that are running Linux. And so that's what we'll mostly focus on here in this video. Now slang shaders are a little bit more robust and newer, and they often have a lot more options. but they are usually limited to things like Android devices as well as like handheld PCs. And there is some cross-pollination between the two, and so you will find some shaders on both GLSL as well as Slang, but in general the heavy-duty ones will be on Slang and the lightweight ones will be under GLSL. And also depending on the version of RetroArch and the custom firmware that you're using, you may not have these same shaders across your various devices. And so what I've done for the shaders that I do recommend, I've put them in that pack that I mentioned before, and we'll show you how to install those here later. Now, if you open up the RetroArch quick menu and you go near the bottom, you will find an option called Shaders. What you want to do here is then turn it on and then go down to Load Preset. And once you load that, you will see a bunch of different subfolders, and this is where it can get really intimidating. And to be honest, the best way to figure this stuff out is just to go in and try each of these shaders and see which one you like the best. But for the purposes of this video, I do want to narrow it down quite a bit. So we're only going to talk about 3 types of shaders altogether. We're going to start with interpolation shaders. And these, as expected, you can find in the interpolation folder. And so there's going to be a bunch of different options within here. And if you've watched some of my videos where I talk about shaders, some of these might look pretty familiar, including the one called Pixelate and then Sharp Bilinear 2x Prescale. And the thing about interpolation shaders is that most of these will actually balance out your pixels as well as making it relatively sharp, much like we did with the filter trick a minute ago. And so as an example, let's try out this Pixelate shader. And so here we are with Sonic the Hedgehog, and I think it looks good. The pixels are balanced and everything looks sharp. So here we are again with Mega Man X, and you can see that with the Pixelate shader, we're getting some pretty balanced pixels when it comes to the life bar, and still everything looks nice and sharp. And so if you are looking for just a very down and dirty way of balancing out pixels while using non-integer scaling, then an interpolation shader will work out pretty well. However, there is one downside when using a shader like this, and it's an effect called shimmering. And it'll really depend on the game that you're playing, but the idea is that as you move, especially with a side-scrolling game like this, you may see a little bit of wobble with the pixels in the background. And that has to do with the interpolation effect that we were talking about before. Now, honestly, on a smaller handheld like this, it's very hard to see the shimmering, and so it's not a big deal either way. However, there is one special shader that's been made by the community, and it's called Sharp Shimmerless Shader. And the idea is that it gives you the really nice pixel balance that we're seeing here, plus it's sharp, plus it doesn't have that shimmering or wobble. The only negative is that it's not already preloaded in RetroArch, so you have to manually install it, which I will show you how to do later in this video. Either way, that's what an interpolation shader will do. It'll basically balance out the pixels while keeping it pretty sharp. Okay, the next type of shaders I want to talk about are called handheld shaders, and they have their own folder as well. And within here, you've got a bunch of different options, including those that are specific to like different types of Game Boy Advance, and so on. And these can do a number of different things, including their own colorization, as well as like LCD grid filters, things like that. Now, the shader that I use the most within this folder is called LCD3X, and this just gives a really nice grid overlay. And so here's an example with it turned on compared to what it looks like with it turned off. And so you can see it does give a nice little grid overlay, and I think that really enhances the image. Okay, and finally, the last type of shader I wanted to mention are CRT shaders. So these are going to mimic what it looks like on an old TV from back in the day. And throughout this video, all the research that I did over the past several weeks, it was the CRT shaders that took me the longest because it is such a deep rabbit hole. Not only are there just a ton of different shader options out there, but many of them just require too much performance power to be able to use on a low-powered handheld like what we're showing today. Not only that, many of these shaders were made with higher resolutions in mind. So a full-screen TV or a computer monitor, something that's like in 1080p or higher with a 16:9 aspect ratio display. So finding a shader that works well with a small handheld like this is quite a challenge. For the most part, if you were just to go into this CRT folder and start picking some of these, you will see that it'll instantly bog down your device. There are a couple lightweight ones that work out pretty well. For example, this CRT one-tap one is actually pretty great. But that also brings up another issue, and that is that most of these CRT shaders will not work with non-integer scaling. You see all these scan lines going across and how it looks kind of junky? That doesn't really have to do with the CRT shader, but rather the fact that we're using non-integer scaling. And so here's what it looks like with integer scaling on. You can see it's much more balanced and it looks correct. And so the two things to keep in mind when it comes to CRT shaders is that they're mostly going to be pretty heavyweight, but then also they will often require integer scaling. In addition, after spending all this time researching a bunch of shaders, I found that my favorite among them is also not available just within vanilla RetroArch on most handhelds. And so again, I've added this one to my shaders and overlay pack, and I'll show you how to install those here in a moment. Okay, so that's really it when it comes to shaders. These are GPU intensive as opposed to CPU intensive with filters. Now let's move on to the last piece of the puzzle, which are overlays. And like I mentioned, an overlay is essentially just something that you throw on top of the screen just to cover everything else up and enhance it even more. So in this this example, I'm using an overlay that gives these borders on the left and right to kind of give it a more enhanced Game Boy experience. In addition, this particular overlay also has some shadowing around the edges, so you might see that as well. And that gives the image a more 3D or in-depth look. And then finally, this one also has a light grid overlay on top of it as well. Some of these overlays will also have specific colorization like this one, and so they affect the color of the screen too. And an overlay will sometimes work in combination with a shader or just in replacement of one as well. You can also use this with filters like bilinear filtering, and the texture of the grid overlay will actually give it more texture overall and make it look a little bit sharper. And so that's kind of how everything works. You have your filters and shaders to kind of affect the image, and then the overlay on top of it, and any combination of these might look really great. Now, like with shaders, most overlays, especially those that come with RetroArch, have been made with like 1080p screens in mind, things like a computer monitor or a TV. And so as a result, most of the overlays that you can find within RetroArch just won't work on 4x3 handhelds. But thankfully, that's where the community comes in. In fact, there are multiple different packs that have specific overlays for certain devices or certain firmwares. And so what I've done is I've collected some of those that just kind of work really well universally. And so that's the essence of the shaders and overlay pack that I've made for this video and the written guide, is that it's collected a lot of the work that other people have done just to make it kind of plug and play. Now, this is not meant to supersede any of the work made by the community. In fact, all that stuff is also linked in the written guide. This is really just to give you one specific example that might work the best for you. But I think along with shaders and filters, the best thing you can do is experiment with all the options that you have and find the one that fits you the best. Okay, so that was probably the longest introductory segment of any video I've ever made, but now that we understand each of the elements of a screen and all the things that we can do to it, now let's start putting it together. And as we get into that, I want to categorize what you can do with these screens into 3 different sections. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain each of these and show some examples to give you an idea of what kind of approach you specifically want to make and what you prefer when it comes to emulation. Now, the first example is going to be what I call modern pixels. This is often when you want something to be perfectly balanced and maybe have a nice texture and kind of a crunchy look to it. And this is generally what you're getting with an integer scaling effect. So for example, here's Final Fantasy 3 or 6, depending on who you ask, on the Super Nintendo. And you can see this is an integer scaling. And so all the pixels are perfectly balanced and very chunky looking. And so for many people, including myself, they will prefer a look like this, where it looks nice and balanced, even if it isn't very authentic compared to like a CRT television. And you'll find this in a lot of modern pixel art games as well, like Octopath Traveler, where it's just going to look really chunky and nice. Now, essentially to get this effect, we've got 2 different options. We can either make it integer scaled like this, or we can blow it up to non-integer scaled and then use an interpolation shader like we were mentioning before. That's going to balance out the pixels and also make them as crispy as possible. So this is the first way of looking at it, and this is often what I will show off in my videos, is how to get the most balanced pixels possible while still making everything look nice and crisp. Now, the next category is probably my least favorite. It's what I'm calling an upscaled image. And this one uses a stylized shader or filter in order to smooth out all of the crunchy pixels. And this you can also find in some like HD remasters like the older Final Fantasy games, and it makes everything look a little bit smooth and what I like to call a little bit watercolory as well. And probably the best example is how rounded the text is right here. You can see that it's just been stylized a lot. And so honestly, I'm not a huge fan of this, but I've also got examples of this in the written guide if you want to check this out as well. Okay, and then finally, our last category is what I'm calling pseudo-authentic. So this is trying to recreate the original experience of playing like on an old handheld or maybe on an old CRT television. And so this can use any combination of filters and shaders and overlays to achieve that effect. And so that's probably what we're going to focus on the most in this video. So here's an example of the shader that I think is probably the best one that you can use on retro handhelds. In addition to giving this shader a little bit of a blurrier CRT look, it also will round out and kind of shape the image as well. And so it almost feels like you're playing on a small television instead of a full-on LCD panel. Not only that, we can actually layer some of our shaders. For example, here I'm using a bloom shader in addition to the CRT one that I was just using. And so this will give your fake CRT television a more glowing effect, like you're sitting there at night, eating some popcorn, the room is dark, you're playing Final Fantasy 3 for the very first time. That's the kind of image that we're trying to recreate. Obviously, it's going to kind of blur out certain aspects and whatnot, but that's kind of how it was back in the day. And so this is what I mean by a pseudo-authentic experience. It's not going to have chunky or crispy pixels. Instead, everything's going to be a little bit smoother, maybe a little bit blurry too, but rounded and have a nice bloom to it as well. And I think this is an excellent experience if you're trying to recreate that old retro feel. Now, when it comes to handheld systems, Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, we can do something pseudo-authentic as well in trying to recreate an original device. So for example, with Game Boy Color, I've got integer scaling turned on, then a special overlay that helps to mimic the original Game Boy Color screen. So depending on the type of game that you're playing, either a handheld system or a home console system, you can really dial it in to get the best experience possible. So when it comes down to it, those are the three categories of things that you can do with your screen, and it's all going to be up to you what you prefer the most. We've got the modern pixels, which are going to be very crisp and chunky, and that's going to be with like integer scaling. After that, we have the upscaled image, which is going to be like an HD remastered, which is going to be smooth and stylized. And then finally, of course, we have that pseudo-authentic, and that's going to give us that CRT look, or maybe something like an original handheld. So now I'm going to show you how to apply all those things that we just learned. Now, before we start installing each of our shaders and overlays, there are a couple operating systems that use 4:3 screens that I do want to address because they are a little bit different. So let's start with the stock operating system made on the Amernic RGXX devices, including the 35XX-SP. Now, depending on the version of stock operating system you have, by default, it's actually going to have overlays and shaders already applied. And the way that you can check is by going into the App Center right here. So once you go into here, go into Apps, and then in the Apps section, you'll see an option for bezels. It'll probably say auto by default. And if you open up that app, you've got three different options: auto, off, or manual. Let's just do auto to see how it works. So here with Game Boy, you can see that it's already pre-configured. It's in integer scaling, it has a bezel around it, and it has colorization. On top of that, it does look to have a light grid overlay as well. So if you're just looking for something that's already going to be pre-configured out of the box and you're not really picky about how it looks, then this might actually work out pretty well for you. Now, it is possible to also customize it like we'll do throughout the rest of this video, but you have to go into that app and then turn bezels off first. After that, you can go into RetroArch, make all the configurations yourself. Now, MINUI is a very simple custom firmware made for this device and many others like it. And depending on the device that you're using with this firmware, you have a couple overlay options. And the best way to do that is to open up a game and then press the menu button. Within here, you'll have an options section. And under front-end options, you will see a screen effect setting. By default, it's going to be none, but you can change it to line or grid. And so grid will give you that LCD effect like you're expecting with handheld systems. And so here's a look at Game Boy Color with that grid effect. Now, there's no other thing that you can do, no bezels or anything else, but this is the extent that you can do within MINUI. And same thing when it comes to the line effect. This is it right here with an NES game, so it gives it a slight scan line look. Again, it's not going to be as involved as a CRT shader, but you can see that it does enhance the look a little bit. Either way, that's the extent of what you can do within MINUI. It's a very simple firmware. Now, one thing to keep in mind about Newly as well as Batocera is that they have configurations that work in RetroArch in the emulation station menu, which can mess up your RetroArch settings. So when specifically talking about the shaders that we're going to be applying in this video, what I recommend doing is pressing Start and then go into the Game Settings menu. Then scroll down to the Game Rendering and Shaders section and make sure that your shader set is set to None. This is going to ensure that you have no shader conflicts when you try to set them within RetroArch. And then finally, I wanted to mention Onion OS, available for the Miu Mini and Miu Mini Plus. This one already has a bunch of the shaders and overlays that we're going to be using in this video already installed onto it. In fact, some of these shaders actually look better on this device than others because they fixed a bug within RetroArch. I've also found that the colorization for Game Boy in particular is really dialed in on this one too, and so I think it looks really good. So I'm not going to specifically talk about how to configure this on the Miu Mini and Miu Mini Plus because there's already a great written guide for that, which is linked in my own. Instead, I just wanted to mention when it comes to Miu Mini Plus running Onion, a lot of this stuff is already pre-installed, so it's just a matter of switching out some of the configurations. Okay, now that we've gone through all of that, let's go ahead and start actually installing this stuff with my recommendations. First thing you want to do is go to my written guide, which is linked down below, and then go to the table of contents. There you'll find a section that says my preferred setup for each system. After you click on that, you're going to see a blue box called Instructions, and there's going to be a link that says RGC Overlays Pack. Once you have it downloaded, you'll unzip that file. It's going to come with 3 different folders: RGC Overlays, Palettes, and Shaders. And from there, we just need to add these folders to our device, and that's going to depend on which operating system you're using and which device you're using as well. I'll give you a couple examples to give you an idea, and I have it all written out in the written guide as well. We'll start with MooOS, and for this one, you're going to need your first SD card. Inside the card, you'll find a folder named MooOS. Go into that, and then one called RetroArch. And inside that, you'll find folders called Overlays and Shaders. And as you probably guessed, you just need to move the RGC Overlays and Shaders folders into the appropriate folder here. After that, we just need to add the palettes, and this one's a little bit unique. This goes into the BIOS folder. So in MooOS, that means you're going to go into the MooOS folder and then BIOS. From there, open up the RGC palettes folder. You'll find a folder named palettes. Go ahead and just drag this over into your BIOS folder. And that's really about it. Depending on your firmware, you need to find your shaders and overlays folder and then drag the RGC ones into there, and then find your BIOS folder and put that palettes folder inside. Now, to be fair, finding the BIOS folder on your firmware is probably very easy. It's probably right there on the SD card, but finding the overlays and shaders can be really challenging. MuOS is probably the easiest. But the nice thing is it doesn't really matter where you put these overlays and shaders folders as long as you navigate to them within RetroArch. So my advice is if you don't want to like FTP into your device and find the specific place within the Linux partition, it might be easier just to throw it into a new folder on the same SD card that you have all your ROMs and BIOS. From there, you just have to remember where you put them so that way when you're in RetroArch, you can navigate to it within their own file browser. And like I mentioned, I've got instructions for all that in the written guide, so I'm not going to belabor that point too much. Long story short, just get this stuff onto your SD card. That way you can find it as we go through the rest of the video. Okay, to start, let's talk about Game Boy. Now, when it comes to Game Boy and both Game Boy Color, I'm going to show you integer scaled as well as non-integer scaled options, because depending on the size of your screen, you may want to go one route or the other. So here we are with just the raw image here with Game Boy using DuckTales as our example. First thing we're going to do is set the integer scaling, but because the overlay we're going to use is in a specific position, we also have to reposition the image. So first thing, we're going to get into the RetroArch quick menu, and then we will back out and go into settings and then video. From there, we will go into scaling, and then what we'll do is turn on integer scaling. And then under aspect ratio, you want to set this to custom. Now, setting up integer scaling and custom is going to blow up the screen more than it actually will fit. So we need to reduce the aspect ratio as well. And all you have to do is just knock this down to a 3x integer scale for both. Now next, this is kind of counterintuitive, but we're going to turn integer scaling off. And that will actually allow us to have a custom position for the aspect ratio. So when it comes to both Game Boy and Game Boy Color, we're going to resize this. We're going to make the X position 80. And then from there, the Y position is going to be changed to 12. And so these are the settings that we want to have. And again, all of this is explained in the written guide if you want to follow it there as well. And so this is what it's going to look like. We now have it integer scaled, but it's also centered within the screen. Now we're going to set up an overlay to give it a nice grid look as well as to cover up some of these black bezels. So again, back in our quick menu, we're now going to go down into the on-screen overlay. And from here, we want to go into overlay preset. And depending on where you put your overlays, this is going to be different. So here you can see that I put them in the correct overlay folder, but you may have to do some navigation here. And here within RetroArch, you would just press the parent directory until you get to some sort of directory that makes sense, and then navigate to wherever it is you need to go. And like I mentioned, it's going to be different for every operating system, but I did put some pointers in the written guide. Either way, once you've found your RGC overlays folder, we're going to go into here. And because we're using integer scaling, I recommend using the Geltron one right here, GBDMG. So once you set that, press the A button, it'll bring you back to the main menu. And then make sure your overlay opacity is at 1.0. So we're just going to move this all the way to the right. And so this is what it'll look like when we have it set up. This overlay plus this opacity. From there, we'll press the B button to get back to the quick menu, and then we're going to go into core options. And now we're going to set a specific colorization that the author of this overlay recommends. So under GB colorization, we're going to set this to internal. From there, under internal palette, we're actually going to pick this one at the bottom that says Pixel Shift Pack 1. After you have that set, you want to navigate down to the Pixel Shift Pack 1 palette. And from here, we want to pick the Pixel Shift 03 option. After that, if you want a little bit of LCD ghosting, I would recommend going down to interframe blending and then set this to simple. And that's all the configuration we have to do. So now we can press resume. And so this is what it's going to look like. Now, right off the bat, you might see this is a pretty bright shader. So what I would recommend doing is reducing the brightness. So you can press the menu button and volume down on this particular custom firmware. And so this is our overall effect. It's very subtle, but I like the fact that it's just a muted type of green. And because it's integer scaled, everything is going to be pixel perfect. Now, if you want something a little bit more intense, you can always change out the colorization. Let's try a different one. So now under internal palette, I'm going to change it from Pixel Shift over to Special 1. This is one that I've always liked that gives a pretty subtle green look as well. And so this is what it looks like with the Special 1 colorization instead. So a little bit more of an intense green, so you might like this one better. Either way, that's basically how you would set up Game Boy games when it comes to integer scaling based on my own RGC overlay pack. Now the next thing we want to do is save this so that every time that we start up a Game Boy game, we can have this exact same effect. And this is very simple. Just go back into the quick menu, and then there's a section called Overrides. And when it comes to Game Boy and Game Boy Color, we want to choose Save Content Directory Overrides. And that's because both of those systems use the same core. So if we did a Save Core override, it would affect the Game Boy Color one. By doing a Save Content Directory Override, it's saying only affect the games within the Game Boy folder. And when it comes to Game Boy in this particular setup, that's all we have to do. So we can just set Save Content Directory Override, and we are now good to go. Okay, so now let's say that you don't want to use integer scaling, but you want to use non-integer scaling. That's going to be a different setup, but only slightly so. So this time around, we're going to go back into the quick menu. It's going to look a little bit different because I'm using MooOS on this device, but it's going to be the exact same process. It's just that the RetroArch menu, it just looks a little bit different. Either way, first thing we want to do is go into settings and then video and then scaling. And so here it's going to be a totally different setting. We're going to turn off integer scaling so that it blows up to fill the screen. Also make sure that your aspect ratio is set to core provided, so it's the correct aspect ratio as well. From there, we're going to go back into the quick menu, and this time we're going to go into the shaders section. And this time we're going to go into load preset because we want to use one of those shimmerless shaders because we're using non-integer scaling. Now, honestly, by default, MooOS already uses the sharp shimmerless shader. It's really awesome, but I'm going to show you how to load it up manually because it's part of that RGC pack as well. So this time we're going to go into load preset, and then we're going to navigate to the RGC shaders folder. And from there, you're going to have an option of the GLSL or slang shaders. We're going to pick the GLSL one. And then within there, you'll find the sharp shimmerless shader, so just go ahead and pick that. Now the way that shaders are saved are different, so what we want to do at this point is actually save a preset. So we're going to go down here to save preset, and we're going to select save content directory preset. This means that every time we start up a Game Boy game in particular, it is going to load up that shimmerless shader. And once you press that and it's saved it successfully, we're good to go with the shader, but we still need to add that overlay. So now we will go back into the quick menu, and now we're going to go into on-screen overlay. Now this time when we go into overlay preset, we need to find the one that's called Perfect GB DMG. And again, this will be inside the RGC folder. Once we've selected that, make sure that your opacity is 1.0 and we are now good. Now we'll go back to the quick menu and then go into core options to set our colorization. And this time under GB colorization, instead of using internal, we're going to use one called custom. And this by default is going to load that custom palette that we added to our BIOS folder. Also, while you're here, you can adjust the interframe blending to turn it on to simple if you would like. And honestly, that's it. So let's go back and go into the quick menu and resume. And this is now what it looks like. And same thing here. If you don't like this colorization, you want to try out something else, then experiment with the other options that you have within the core options. Now, if we want to save this, the only other thing we have to do is set a content directory override. And so again, now we'll go back into the quick menu, which in MooOS is going to be menu plus X. And then finally go into overrides and then save content directory overrides. And there we go. We have now configured both integer scaling and non-integer scaling for Game Boy. We're going to go a little bit more quickly through the rest because it's all going to be fairly similar. And for Game Boy Color, we'll do the same thing first. We're going to set integer scaling, we're going to resize the screen and put it in the right position, and then add an overlay. So same thing when it comes to the video scaling options. We're going to use a custom aspect ratio, then we're going to reposition it to 80 and 12, and we're going to use a 3x integer scale. From there, we'll go back to the quick menu, then on-screen overlay, and now again, we're going to go back into that RGC pack, and then we're going to pick this one, Geltron GB Color. And then also make sure your opacity is at 1.0. From there, we're going to go back into core options and then change out the color correction to whatever you would like. Set this to GBC only, then you can do accurate or fast, or you can just turn it off altogether. In this example, I am going to use Game Boy Color only as well as fast. And so here we are. This is the Game Boy Color look with integer scaling turned on. We've got a nice subtle overlay and then that power LED, and then we've also got some pretty good colorization and a grid overlay too. And so altogether, I think this is probably one of the best ways you can play integer scaled Game Boy Color. Now, if you don't want integer scaling, this is what we're going to use instead. So we'll have a little bit of overlay on the left and right, but then also a grid on top and then that shadowing on the sides as well. First thing, go into the video scaling settings, make sure your integer scale is turned off. From there, back in the quick menu, let's go into on-screen overlay, and then you want to pick this one called Perfect GBC. Now for this one in particular, I find that the grid is very dark, and so what I usually will do instead is use a 0.75 overlay opacity. From there, go into quick menu and then shaders. We want to add that shimmerless shader because this is non-integer scaling. So same thing here, we're going to go into load preset, find the one that says RGC shaders, and then go into GLSL and then sharp shimmerless shader. Once you've loaded that up, go into Save Preset and then Save Content Directory Preset, and then go back into the quick menu under Core Options and then change out the color correction to whatever you would like. Again, we're going to use Game Boy Color only and fast. So this is what it's going to look like in the end. We've got that sharp shimmerless shader to make sure that everything is going to look nice and balanced, but then we have the overlay on top giving it a grid as well as the bezels on the side and a little bit of shadowing. After that, we've got the color correction to give us a more authentic look, although it is still relatively saturated. And so there you go. Depending on the look that you're going for with Game Boy Color, you can get something that's perfectly crisp with integer scaling, or you can also blow it up a little bit with the help of a shader. Either way, I think both of these are great, but personally, I like to have as big a screen as possible, so I like this one right here. Okay, next let's talk about Game Boy Advance. So here we're going to use non-integer scaling because integer scaled is just way too small, but we are going to use a special shader and overlay just to make sure everything is nice and balanced. First, you want to go into the video settings, then scaling, and we want to turn integer scaling on. I know we're not actually going to use integer scaling, but it's necessary to get to the next step. Now under aspect ratio, change this to custom, and then finally go back to integer scale and then turn this one off. Now what's going to happen is the screen is going to get all wonky, but trust me, it's pretty easy to fix. So first, let's go into custom aspect ratio width. And here we want to set it to 640, which is going to be the width of our screen. Now under the height, we want to change this to 427. And there we go. Now we have something that's filling up the entire screen, but it's also at the top of the screen, which is important because we want our overlay underneath. Now go back into the quick menu and select on-screen overlay. And this time under the overlay preset, we're going to select the one that says perfect GBA. And again, like with all the others, this is part of that RGC pack that you downloaded and installed. Now the thing about this overlay, even though it's a 75% overlay, it's a little bit dark. So if you want, you can reduce the opacity here. We're just going to leave it at 1.0 so you can see what it looks like. And then finally, we're going to apply a sharp shimmerless shader just in the same way that we had before. So we'll go into load preset, we'll go into the RGC shader section, and then GLSL shaders and sharp shimmerless. And then also make sure that when you're in here, go to save preset and then save core or content directory preset. It doesn't really matter. And so here we are. We've now got this nice Game Boy Advance overlay here on the bottom, a nice grid on top of it, and everything is nice and perfectly centered. Even though it's not integer scaled, that sharp shimmerless shader will help balance everything out, and that grid overlay will also provide a nice sharp texture. Okay, honestly, we've only got two more sections to really talk about, and that's going to be our pixel-based home console systems, and then our more 3D-based home console systems. So for the pixel-based stuff, that's going to be everything from 8-bit to 16-bit, Super Nintendo, Nintendo, Genesis, all this kind of falls into the same boat. And it's all really going to come down to what you enjoy the most. Do you want to have sharp pixels? Or would you rather have something that looks like a little TV? Now, same thing with the 3D-based systems. That's going to be like Nintendo 64 and PS1. And same thing, we're going to find something that's a little bit sharp and nice looking, and then also a full-on TV effect too. Okay, we're going to start with NES, and I want to make sure that these pixels are as balanced and crispy as possible, but then also filling up the entire screen. So first thing we want to do is go into our settings, then video, and then scaling. And here under aspect ratio, I'm going to set it to full. That means it's going to fill up the entire 4:3 display. Depending on the emulator or the cropping that you have within the core options, you may not get a full screen, so I like to set this to full instead. Now back in the quick menu, we want to go to shaders, and then we want to load preset, and you guessed it, we're going to do that shimmerless one. And again, you'll find it under the retro game core shaders, and then GLSL, and then sharp shimmerless. From there, go to Save Preset, and then you can do Save Core Preset. And so now this is what it's going to look like. We have nice balanced pixels that are relatively sharp, and then also it's going to fill up the entire screen. However, there is one other thing I recommend trying out, and that's going to be a CRT overlay, just to give it a little bit more of a texture. So in this example, we'll go down to On-Screen Overlay, and then under Overlay Preset, we're going to pick the one that says Geltron CRT. And again, for this one, we want to have it at a 1.0 opacity. And so here is the final result. We've got a little bit of roundedness around the edges, and it's got a slight scan line or CRT effect as well. And so I love this because it's subtle and then also just very nice and balanced. Okay, so now let's say you want to do a full CRT television effect. So let's do that next. First thing, we need to go into video and then scaling and then turn integer scaling on. And at that point, you can also just keep the aspect ratio at full. It's still going to be a nice 4:3. From there, under quick menu, make sure your on-screen overlay is turned off because we don't want that conflicting with the shader we're about to use. And then finally, under quick menu shaders, we're going to go into load preset and then back to the RGC shaders. But this time we're going to pick this one. It's called ZFast CRT GOS Video. Essentially what this means is it's going to be a lightweight shader that will give you a bit of a curving around the screen. And it's also going to replicate the S-video effect, so it's going to be a tiny bit blurry as well. And so this is what it's going to look like on a 480p display, and I think it looks really good. You can see that it has a 3D effect and that the corners are a little bit darker and then it kind of pushes towards the center. In addition, you can see that the sides are a little bit rounded on each end as well. And finally, you can see that it's also quite blurry like an old CRT television. But let me show you how to change the blurriness as well. And to do that, we're going to go back into the shader section, but this time we're going to affect something that's called a shader parameter. And you can find that right here on the bottom after you've loaded your shader. Now, each of these parameters will be different by shader, but I really like the ones that we have in this one. So first thing I like to do is increase the scanline amount up to 12.0. This is going to make the lines across a little bit more prominent. From there, we have this convergence on each of the axes, and the closer we get each of these to 0 means the less blurry that they will be. So generally what I do is I set the first one to 0.5 and then the other one to -0.2. That's just going to make it a little bit less blurry than it was before. And so now this is what the effect is going to look like. We still have the same scan lines and the overall look, but I found it to be just a tiny bit sharper, just better for the 21st century. And so at this point, if you're happy with how this one looks, you can just save your shader parameter and then also a core override and you are good to go. However, there is one more effect that we can do and you might like this one as well. So this time we're going to add a second shader, but we actually want to put it underneath the CRT effect. And this is going to be that bloom shader that we had talked about before. Now this time we don't want to load a preset because that will overwrite the one that we just set. Instead, we want to either prepend or append the preset. If we do the append one, that means it's going to go over on top of it, but because we're using a bloom shader, we want it to go underneath. So this time we're going to go under prepend preset. And setting this up is just going to be like any other shader. So this time we're going to go into blurs. And this time under the blurs folder, we will find this one on the bottom. It says Kawase Glow. And all we have to do is just set that one and we are good to go. Okay, so this is now how it looks, and it's got a much more dreamy effect. You can see that the colors are a little bit more washed out, and it almost looks like an old and kind of aged television. And again, this is all personal preference, so you may like this or you may not. Either way, those are the two options. You can either do this CRT effect with or without this bloom. Now, if you like it as it is, then you would just go into Save Preset and then Save Core Preset, and that'll save this entire shader setup. And of course, if you don't want to have that blooming effect, you can just remove it and only load that ZFast one instead, and this is what it'll look like again. For my part, I'm going to keep it on this one for NES, so let's go ahead and save it as it is. We're going to go back into our shaders section, then go into Save Preset, and then Save Core Preset. After that, we want to go into Overrides, and then Save Core Overrides. And that's it. Now we're set up that anytime we start up an NES game, this is what it's going to look like. So as another example, here's River City Ransom, which has that same CRT effect. It's not quite as prominent because you can see there are borders at the top and bottom of this game, but you can still see that it's slightly rounded and has that nice soft effect to it. Here's another look at a game. This is Metroid on the NES, and I think it looks great. Now, when it comes to Super Nintendo, I found that because maybe it has a bigger pixel density, I like having this bloom effect. And so here I have the glow shader and then also that CRT shader on top of it. And again, it's all really going to be up to you whether or not you want something that's a little bit sharper or something that has a more CRT effect to it. Now, when it comes to the higher end systems, things like PlayStation and Dreamcast and Nintendo 64, I have found that using that CRT effect plus the bloom also looks very good. I think it'll really come down to what you prefer when it comes to the overall look and feel of your CRT system. One thing to bear in mind is when it comes to Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast, depending on the device and whether or not it's a low-end device, you might actually not be able to use any of these RetroArch effects. And that's because on many custom firmwares, they use standalone emulators that don't use RetroArch. And so as a result, you just may not have the ability to use these effects just because there isn't enough performance to accommodate them. Either way, I did want to show that yes, all these CRT effects we were just talking about will also apply to 3D era games too, like PlayStation. And again, when it comes to a CRT effect, I think it looks really good. It almost gives me like a late night gaming feel. But now I want to talk about one final setup that you can do with this that also looks pretty good. So first thing we want to do is go into the video scaling settings and we want to turn bilinear filtering on. That obviously is going to make our image a lot softer, but again, it's not going to be too bad because we have such a high density of pixels. Now under video shaders, just make sure you turn them off because we're not going to need any of these. Instead, all we're going to use is just a simple overlay. So we're going to go into Display Overlay, Overlay Preset, and then under the RGC overlays, we're going to pick the one that says Geltron CRT. And again, make sure your opacity is set to 1.0. And honestly, that's all you have to do. Just give it bilinear filtering, give it a CRT texture on top of it, and it's going to kind of smooth everything out and then also make it a little bit sharper. And so I found this to be a good middle ground where we've got a slightly blurry picture, but it gives a lot of depth to the image as well. And so I think that looks very good. And again, we're not going to have like super crispy pixels, but for this particular system, I don't really mind that at all. Instead, I think this is just a nice middle ground between a full-on CRT effect, but then also giving us that depth that we're looking for. Okay. You made it. I can't believe that we took so long to make this video. I think I recorded something like 4 or 5 hours of footage of me just yammering on about this. Obviously, I'm going to edit it down and hopefully it'll be like less than an hour. Either way, this was a doozy of a guide and congratulations on getting through it. At the end of the day, I had 2 goals in mind. The first was to give you all the building blocks when it comes to affecting your screen in the way that you want. And then I wanted to show off my own personal preferences in case you were wondering so that you could set them up yourself. From here, I expect that you should be able to experiment and try all sorts of other shaders and different overlay packs and whatnot. I've got it all linked in that written guide. Either way, I hope you found this guide helpful and let me know if you have any questions in the comments down below. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.